Al Vander Woude is perhaps the single most underappreciated hero of the early Wildcat days of funny car drag racing. He's among the many racers of the era who can't be judged or even really ranked on their statistics, not because he didn't win, not because he didn't get attention, but because he marched to the beat of his own drummer, ran very few national meets with the likes of the NHRA or AHRA of the time, and match raced a relentless schedule with a frequency few could have ever hoped to equal. He was a drag racing vaudeville star, and I say that not with derision, I say it with more respect than my words can convey. I also say it because Al Vander Woude and his series of Flying Dutchman funny cars understood the show business of 1960s drag racing on a level beyond anyone else, maybe in the entire sport. The result was a career that spanned from the formative days of drag racing in the early 50s and lasted through the end of his life in 2001 at the age of 67 years old. Al Vander Woude went by Woody, and he was the physical embodiment of funny car drag racing for the majority of his life. While the earliest era of his racing career is not well documented and perhaps not all that notable, we know that Vander Woude started to make some noise in the sport around Southern California in the first half of the 1960s fielding gassers. While I couldn't find any images of his 1940 Willys, I did find this one, his 1933 Willys, or Willis as you may prefer, which was run up until the 1964 season. The car, an A-gas class machine, would set the tone for the rest of Vander Woude's long career. He built the car himself, from the chassis to the engine. It was neat as a pin, and while he didn't have near the wallet of many of his competitors, he had the brains and the hands to replace money with know-how. There's no record of any big wins with this car or anything, but it was the last machine he ran before moving into the class that he not only best fit, but the one that he most loved. Funny car. Before we go any further, we should mention the fact that Vander Woude was born in Iowa in 1934. He lived in California from sometime in the 1940s through about 1970 and ended up living in Kansas City for the last decades of his life. He served in the United States Navy as a Seabee. A lot of his mechanical skills are credited to that experience in various stories and recollections that I researched. The man was clearly a hot rodder and an inveterate builder of things. In fact, if you believe the magazine stories of 1966, by the time he decided to go funny car racing, he had already built and raced 20 different cars. Standing 6'3" with a wiry, slender build, a long neck, and a set of eyes so deeply inset into his head his eyebrows provided them shade, Vander Woude looked capable of beating you on the racetrack or in a dark alley if you wanted to try your chances. Long story short, this dude 100% had the funny car vibes. While racing his gasser, Vander Woude, like everyone else, noticed how people were gravitating toward the wild, altered wheelbase funny cars of the day. Sometimes classified as ultra stocks and sometimes as stock fuel experimental, and even sometimes classified as altereds as we've discussed in other videos, these cars had no proper class and had the guys making the rules up at night wondering what to do with them. They also had an exploding match racing scene that paid handsomely if you could crack your way into it. If you were a guy like Dave Strickler, Butch Leal, Al Extrand, or the Ram Chargers, you could get your hands on the hottest thing at the strip in this era, an altered wheelbase, Hemi-powered Dodge or Plymouth. If you were Al Vander Woude, you could either lament your lack of cachet with the factory, or you could do something about it, and as we'll see throughout his life, as he so often did, he chose the second option. Vander Woude bought a used 1964 Plymouth and gutted it. Constructing his own frame out of 2x4 box chromoly steel, he took the altered wheelbase concept even further than the factory did. He moved the front wheels up the same 10 inches as Chrysler, but in the rear, instead of the 10-inch forward shift, he went 15 inches forward, placing the rear tires at the very edge of the doors. This made for a wheelbase of 100 sketchy inches. When the car first came out, the engine was carbureted, and then for the majority of its life, it was injected. A 426 Hemi that now displaced 510 cubic inches was fed a cocktail of alcohol and nitromethane in a heavy dose. The floor he crafted from sheet aluminum along with the inner fenders and the firewall. With a Chrysler rear axle packing 411 gears, leaf springs, and an art car push-button shifted torque flight, the drivetrain was set. Up front, he used a chromoly steel tube axle, parallel leaf springs, and Willys spindles on the ends. Drenching the car in metallic green paint, adding green metal flake in the interior along with the seat, and Goodyear slicks on the back, Al was in business, and business was good. The machine was not only immediately competitive, but its propensity to pull massive wheelies made it a sensation in California. The match race bookings came in, and they came in quick. And here's where the showmanship angle of Vander Woude's personality paid off in spades. Famously, at this time in history, Chrysler executives had sent a memo to their altered wheelbase teams to cease and desist doing wheelies. The cars had not been designed for such treatment, and when they broke, they would miss match race bookings, and such, the investment that Chrysler was making into the cars and the entire program would be lost. Since Al Vander Woude was his own man, he did what the others could not, and there are loads and loads of photos of this car leaping off the starting line, front end up, and hauling down the strip to the delight of fans. Remember, door slammers pulling wheelies at this time in drag racing was still kind of a freak show, and people went nuts over it. And it was this car that really launched Al's star. People naturally gravitated to the underdog element, the fact he had no factory sponsorship, and not only the fact he could do wheelies, but that he did them on purpose time and time again. When they knew this car was coming, they ran to the fences to watch. Vander Woude traveled the machine all through 1965, running in funny car match races, also in some organized competition where the car would be classified as a C altered. That's where this homemade creation fit with its wildly relocated rear axle. Through the course of that season, he saw the world changing again around him. By early 1966, the altered wheelbase cars had given way to factory flip-top funny cars and all kinds of insane ideas around the sport on the best way to hustle down the strip, as well as the best way to make money as a match racing exhibition act. Al needed a new car, and it was not going to be anything like anyone else was running already. If the altered wheelbase car of 1965 had put the Flying Dutchman name on the nation's drag racing map, the 1966 car would launch it like a bottle rocket. Once again built end-to-end, including the paint by Vander Woude himself, it followed no one else's designs or rules and employed every engineering experiment he wanted to try, along with the showmanship angle he had already mastered. It's impossible to say that Vander Woude employed lessons learned from the Plymouth while constructing the crazy 1966 Dart, in fact the craziest 1966 Dart on Earth. This car was an absolute and complete departure other than the use of a box-style frame. Vander Woude would build the longest wheelbase funny car in existence at that time, utilizing a wheelbase of 132 inches. The vehicle had an astounding overall length of 196 inches. The rear tread width was 50 inches. The body of exceptionally unique dimensions was fabricated by A&A Engineering of Atlanta, Georgia. Comprised of a series of custom panels, the long nose, extended doors, and half-roof section, the car was a giant rolling cartoon version of a Dodge Dart. This was the epitome of an unlimited funny car match racer in 1966. Positioning the driver's seat directly over the rear axle like a modern funny car, he looked directly over the top of a blown Hemi power plant. The engine was, to start with, a 392 cubic inch Hemi, which was topped with a 671 blower. More on that in a second. A drop tube axle with transverse leaf springs and a pair of hairpins made up the front suspension. Directly behind the axle were two oblong tanks, one for fuel, typically a 75 to 80% blend of nitro, and the other for water to cool the engine, as was the practice of the time. This especially true with match race cars that needed to be run multiple times on any given typical night schedule. The floor, like that of the Plymouth, was made from 75 thousandths thick aluminum sheeting. The factory-style Chrysler rear axle was mounted on a set of leaf springs in the rear of the car, and it carried the only brakes the car would have, which was a pair of stock drums along with a 16-foot Breedlove cross-form parachute. The roll bar, and this needs to be emphasized that this was not a full-tube chassis car. It was a box-frame car with a roll bar on the back of it, which was designed by Sam Davis of Davis Header Company. He happened to fabricate what was then referred to as a, quote, cage-like roll bar to protect Vander Woude in the event something went wrong. Davis also built the headers for the car, which also used a kind of unique for the time 5-point harness in the back for extra safety. Vander Woude claimed the whole build took 1,000 hours from start to finish, with the fire mist metal flake green paint drying at the end. Somewhere along the line, likely early in the car's existence, Al switched to a 426 style Hemi. It wasn't a race Hemi, it was actually a 426 street Hemi that he built the engine off of. Now, the car was profiled in the October 1966 issue of Popular Hot Rodding magazine with a 426 in it. Interestingly, the first feature on the car, in the September 66 issue of Dragstrip, has it in photos with a 392 Hemi in the front of it. The car used a torque-flight automatic transmission, which would become a trend with all his builds. The car's early races were not good. Mechanical issues, handling problems, and the bugs that any new car presents plagued Al Vander Woude, but then there was a breakthrough. At Lyons Dragstrip on his fourth appearance, the car coasted to a best speed of 161 miles an hour. In the following weeks, the machine was busting deep down into the 8s, turning 850s at 176. His idea was validated. Kind of. The car's overall length, with its 132-inch wheelbase when laden down with a giant iron Hemi in the middle, seemed to make it literally bow in the middle when standing still. The second that Al hit the gas, the car would twist and bow up with the engine putting all of its power down. On unsuccessful runs, the car would kind of bounce its way down the course. People would often report seeing the front end up almost going through the finish line traps. On clean runs, it would torque up the left front and carry it some way before setting it down. But the major issue became the half roof. As the performance of the car became more and more consistent, the machine would seemingly want to fly at the top end of the racetrack. While the roof likely contributed, it's hard not to think that the extreme length and ability to capture air under the body may have also been hurting aerodynamics as well. Vander Woude's solution was twofold. He chopped the half roof straight off the car, leaving the roll bar and himself fully exposed to the elements, and he swapped the headers. Going from downswept weed burner style units, he went with near vertical stacks that came up straight through the body on each side of the blown Hemi. These two changes seemingly calmed the car's nerves at speed, with the headers potentially providing some of that downward force and the loss of the roof getting rid of an obstruction, however small, that was potentially acting as a small lever to the rear of the chassis. The car was a fan sensation both with the half roof and without it. Now, it should be mentioned also in 1966, Don Garlits came out with the Garlits Dart 2, which was an outward appearance similar to the roofless Flying Dutchman, but in practice was far different. The Garlits car, driven by Emery Cook, was actually a dragster in disguise, literally. A 120 cubic inch Garlits fuel dragster chassis, which was welded together by Marvin Schwartz, was dressed with a roofless, elongated Dart body, which was one piece. The car also was a match race freak, but not nearly as well received as the Dutchman. It was, however, faster. Cook drove it to a 200-mile-an-hour speed at Sunshine Drag Strip in late 1966, raising the controversial question as to whether it was the very first funny car to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. Now, all that stuff aside, the Flying Dutchman had a banner year in 1966, running a slate of match races into the dozens across the country, and while the car was a handful more often than not, fans loved the machine, and they loved its maverick, independent, non-factory-backed driver. With the financial success of 1966 behind him, Vander Woude went a different way for 1967. He actually hired someone to build him a car. Ted Brown got the call to build the chassis of this 1967 Flying Dutchman Dart. The car used fiberglass doors, nose, and deck lid, but the rest of the body was actually a gutted factory steel shell. Al went back to a 392-style Hemi, bringing it out to 422 cubic inches, and his traditional torque flight and Chrysler axle backed it up. This time he ran a 354 ratio in the rear end. Neil Leffler prepared a 671 blower, which was overdriven 22%. Leaf springs mounted the rear to the chassis, and the car did wear wheelie bars at many races. Sprayed in his now trademark green paint, the car was by far the most competitive and normal piece of iron he had ever run, from the chassis all the way through the engine combination. Now, he did include one interesting hidden trick to enhance the car's show appeal. Tunnels were opened up facing forward of the rear tires between the chassis and the body. These funneled massive amounts of smoke toward the front of the car, so during burnouts, this thing was a rolling fog bank, and the crowds ate it up. Still a wild handful of a car, it was able to run 804 at 184, placing it right in the thick of the best funny cars of the country in this period. During his match racing tour, he was able to provide a real threat and actually beat some of the more nationally famous machines out there. The underdog hero also performed well at open races where dozens of cars would attend and qualifying was mandatory. For instance, at Bakersfield, the car went to the final round of the 2,400-pound funny car class, coming up short to Doug Cook and the Stone Woods & Cook Dark Horse 2 after battling all the way through the deep, deep field of eliminations. Another full season of match race madness ensued, but once again, Vander Woude looked around and saw the world changing. He was going to go back to his shop and build a new car, and this time, he was going to build it himself. What he turned out was his masterpiece. A full-scale 1968 Charger drenched in psychedelic green paint, packing a white factory-style vinyl roof and a very modern tubular chassis. It was to be his longest-lasting and most-seen funny car, also some may argue his nicest, and it was built from tip to stern in his Downey, California shop. Funny car racing had evolved a ton in just 3 years. Showmanship therein had changed as well. It was less about racing a freak show now and more about racing something that looked the part of a factory machine. had the fit and finish that defined other styles of auto racing, and that absolutely flew beyond all else. Al Vander Woude nailed it, with his own two hands on every account. The 120-inch wheelbase chassis was based around main rails an inch and a half in diameter made from 70-wall chromoly tubing. Unlike other builders who used main rails that ran in parallel from end to end, the Flying Dutchman chassis was tapered. The upper rail tapered down, wide in the back, and then to a tight V in the front. Coilover shocks replaced leaf springs, and the Art Car transmission, while still there, had been upgraded yet again. The Chrysler rear axle now had a 391 gear set in it, and the engine ran on a 90% load of Nitro. Interestingly, this was a 392 Hemi that had only been taken out to 400 cubic inches. Vander Woude believed that the smaller displacement engine helped to manage torque production and thereby allowed him to get a better bite of the track on the launch. The chassis was painted bone white, as were the headers, a departure from the normally bright red exhaust that you've seen on other cars so far. The engine was detailed, anything that could be polished was, and the fiberglass Trends Charger body is just so awesome looking with that green paint and white vinyl roof. By the time he had finished this car, he had 50 match race bookings, a number he swelled to 60 in the first year of traveling. Out the chute, the car was running sevens at 190 miles an hour, with stated goals of running deep sevens at 200 plus. The Mickey Thompson logos you see on the quarter panels were a large thank you to his most ardent and stalwart supporter. Since his earliest days of drag racing, Vander Woude had run about the entire Mickey Thompson catalog in his cars, from wheels to connecting rods. If they made it and it was usable, he used it. Undoubtedly, that support helped him get this far in his career, and he'd done his job as a relentless promoter of their parts. Vander Woude would race the wheels off this car for longer than any other that he had, competing in the 1968, 69, and 70 seasons with it. Over the course of this time, he moved to Kansas City as well. Vander Woude's popularity and that of the Charger can be followed through the various match racing ads of the day, as well as the fact that he was now doing performance clinics at various Dodge dealerships in the cities he would match race in. Was he now finally a factory guy? Unless it was under the table, it doesn't appear so, but he was an accomplished racer and a mechanic that would educate young hot rodders in the art of making stuff go faster. There is a part of me that believes with the other Dodge performance clinics going on, they couldn't get to everywhere, so the towns that he would go to match race in, maybe smaller than the major cities other teams were at, needed the help, so he would be able to go to the dealership, display his Charger, and help educate some of those young hot rodders. As good as the Charger had been for 3 seasons, Al Vander Woude still had a little weird left in him, and a chance discovery in a Chicago garage began the basis of his most oddball creation yet. In 1968, Dodge released a non-running concept car called the Charger 3. It was kind of positioned to be a competitor to the Corvette. It had a similar style nose, sat 2 people, had a bunch of weird, futuristic for 1968 interior features, and a flip-up style canopy roof to get in and out of. It only sat 42 inches tall and was 184 inches long. Dodge had constructed 3 bodies. 2 of them were used for traveling concept cars, or at least one of them anyway, and it's the car you can see here. It wasn't until 1970 that Al Vander Woude walked into the famed Grand Spalding Dodge in Chicago, yes, the home of Mr. Norm, and while stepping through the shop, he looked up and saw this. The third Charger 3 concept body in bare fiberglass neatly hanging from the rafters. Lord only knows how much sweet-talking and money it took to get his hands on the body, but Al did, and he took it straight home to Kansas City. The ensuing months were spent building a 110-inch chassis, doing all the tin work, body mounting work, paint, and engine work in his shop. How the 6'3" Vander Woude made himself fit in this car is a study in the impossible. The engine was only 50 inches from the rear end, the roof was lower than any funny car on the planet, and yes, the 110-inch wheelbase was pretty hairy in and unto itself. That said, he got it done and hit the road. By all indication, the car's weird looks got it plenty of attention, but its performance on the track really didn't live up to the rest of the package. Its marketing hook as being the only Charger 3 funny car in the world was good, but also one of those things that, once you'd seen it one time, it didn't really have the performance or entertainment longevity it might have otherwise. The car ran for basically 1 season. It was at this point that Al Vander Woude swapped brands. He ran a Ford Maverick-bodied car, sometimes with Tom Johansson driving, and then a series of Mustangs through the 1970s. He also flirted with a fuel-altered for a time in 1971, and as far as the Fords go, a Mach 1 body and then the popular Mustang 2 body were used through the years. He was a match race maven all through those seasons, hitting the occasional national event to test his mettle against the ever-growing number of national touring stars in the sport. What's most amazing to me is that we can follow Al and his son Don into the Nitro funny car world right into the modern days of the sport. They had drivers like Terry Haddock, in some ways a modern version of Al himself, and Jack Wyatt. Both of these men are cut from the same do-it-all cloth that Al was. When these privateer racers who got their modern pro careers started in cars that were owned and tuned by the Vander Woude family name score the occasional underdog win on the NHRA Tour as they do from time to time, we have no doubt that the lanky former Seabee is smiling down from the big drag strip in the sky. I love the story of Al Vander Woude because the guy was compelled by his love of the sport of drag racing, which was unyielding until the day he took his last breath. He did things his own way, and he succeeded mightily while doing it. There are all kinds of stories of people who flash into the sport with an idea and disappear just as quick. There are very, very few stories of guys like Al Vander Woude, a funny car match racing king that understood the mechanics, knew the fabrication, and above all, had the showman and promotional flair ingrained in him, not only to run hard and fast, but to entertain the fans with a great show. The Flying Dutchman was a ship of lore in the high seas. It was mean, it was fast, and if you ran across it out there in the ocean, chances were you were in for a bad time. How fitting is it that Al Vander Woude maintained that awesome historical integrity of the name, powered by Nitro. I'm Brian Lones. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more drag racing, motorsports, mechanical, and ground-shaking Nitro-powered history.